You think that dress codes in religious or spiritual institutions are coming from a place of manipulation or from a place of values? I really want you to think about this as I discuss how dress codes in spiritually abusive environments can be used as a tool of control. My name is Dr. Felucia, and I'm a licensed psychologist. And on this channel, I focus primarily on spiritual abuse. And many of you who have been through spiritual abuse have either talked about this in the comments or, just common knowledge that many of these environments use how people dress as a means of control. And one way that this happens is through modesty driven dress codes. Now, I'm not here to bash modesty. I am not here to bash dress codes. Every person is going to have their own values as to what they think modesty means and what they want to dress like, right? The issue is that in spiritually abusive environments, many times the issue of modesty is coming from a place of manipulation and not really um, true modesty, right? So I'm going to give you an example of this. Many of you have talked about your experiences specifically with dress codes. If you notice that a particular dress code in a spiritual environment only focuses on one gender, that's something that you might want to take a pause and examine that. Many of these environments view women and men very differently. I probably might go into a video about how um, these environments exhibit misogynistic views, but I'll wait to hear from you all in the comments and see if that's something you're interested in. But these environments, they're really coming from a place of control. And one way you can see that is when one gender is focused on. So they might say that you cannot wear this type of outfit, you must have these body parts covered up and things like that. But the way that it is communicated makes the recipient feel a lot of shame. And I can already hear a lot of pushback about this, that no one can make you feel how you feel, and if you don't like it, leave, right? However, there is more to that statement. While it's true that you don't have to attend an environment if you don't agree with their dress codes and things like that, the way that the dress code itself is communicated can be abusive. People have talked about their experiences, especially under purity culture, and women being made to feel like they're responsible for how men view them, right? Again, this is a very nuanced topic. When modesty is expressed from a position of manipulation, what it does is that it really puts a lot of responsibility on one person and very little responsibility on the other person. It could be gender in the case that I'm talking about. And so it is coming from a place of shame a lot of times, communicating to women that the way that they present is responsible for how somebody else acts. It really kind of takes the responsibility away from the person who is viewing the subject of modesty. So you might see this in dress codes, right? Now, again, there's nothing wrong with dress codes, but in spiritually abusive environments, the requirements can be communicated in such a way that really bring a lot of shame to the person. So, let me give you an example, right? They might say that this, let's say they'll say like this skirt is too short or something. Um, there's a way to communicate that. And sometimes this has been done in a way that the person who's on the receiving end feels shame. They feel publicly called out, things like that. So I want you to think about that. Have you ever experienced that or seen that happen? That's important. Another thing that you want to think about when you are examining the issue of modesty and dress codes is how value is tied to appearance. And institution might, not like a particular style of dress, or they may want a particular style of dress for their members to adhere to. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you examine the remnants of purity culture, you will find that a lot of people felt and were told that their worth was directly related to how they dress. So, good girls and good women cover up these parts of their body and dress a certain way. And bad women, and they call them Jezebels, whatever, don't cover up, right? So that's something you will often hear, and the emphasis is on the person that needs to cover up instead of the person that should not be looking, right? And again, it's a balance. It's a controversial topic, and so I want to be careful in terms of how I frame this and how I bring up my points. Something that I say all the time about this channel is you have to be able to think in nuanced terms. I'm not saying that modesty itself is bad. I'm not saying that dress codes are bad. I am saying, however, that in spiritually abusive environments, there are commonalities in terms of how expectations for dress are communicated. One thing that I find particularly damaging is when people are called out for certain things that are not explicitly communicated. So if an organization wants everyone to dress a certain way, it needs to be specified. People have told me about their experiences where they will go to an environment and they will wear something. This is both men and women. They'll wear something. Maybe it's not traditional, right? Maybe it has a lot of bright colors or whatever, and they were criticized for wearing that. So even though we tend to associate modesty with women, especially being covered up, you will see this type of reasoning applied to other types of clothing that, yes, they could cover things up, but at the same time, they could be considered worldly. They could be considered too loud, right? There are there are many sorts of values that spiritually abusive people and institutions attach to how one dresses. And so you have to be really careful about that. And one thing that I've noticed too about a lot of spiritually abusive environments is that they won't be direct about what they expect, right? If you go to a place and they tell you, we expect, the men to wear skirts and dresses, they're not allowed to wear pants, and this is what the men have to wear, then you can decide for yourself, hey, do I want to be a part of this or not? But what a lot of times happens is that somebody is targeted for how they dress. And the so-called offense has nothing to do with modesty. It has more to do with control. I have heard stories from women about how because they took pride in their appearance, because they were fashionable, that they were called immodest, even though nothing that they wore was revealing. And so, do you see how that issue of modesty is being weaponized in that situation? It's really important. And you will, as I talk about this some more, I really want you to think about experiences that you've had, especially when you feel like the messages that were directed at you were more veiled, right? So there are, I want you to think about that, right? And I also want you to think about what modesty means. If you were to call 10 people into a room and tell them, what does it mean for someone to dress modestly? I guarantee you that all 10 of them will have different answers. And so it's also important to understand that modesty is subjective and one's inherent worth is not tied to how they fit the modesty criteria for that particular environment. So I want you to really think about that. And where the issue of manipulation comes in is the attempt to control somebody through what they wear. And I've heard this many times from individuals, especially individuals that like to be fashionable. they're told that an outfit maybe is distracting, even though maybe it just has bright colors. Um, I remember hearing a sermon about and this person said that because he had a beard, that he was told that his beard was somehow immodest and he needed to shave it or he was going to hell. So this is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about where it becomes a control issue because, you know, telling somebody that their facial hair is tied to their eternal destiny makes absolutely no sense to me at all. But again, it's coming from the place of control. So I want you to think about that. Have you ever been made to feel ashamed because of how you dress? Um, that's important. And you also want to make sure too that whatever codes that are being talked about, that's being talked about in a balanced way. Many of these communications and conversations around dress codes target one particular group. Many times it's women. And so the message is you are responsible for controlling somebody else's problems with lust. And so again, that's where that balance and that nuance comes in. People who think about this and who absorb this message are made to feel like they are 100% in control of how somebody else views them and reacts to them. And that's not true. It's balanced on both parties, right? So if, it's important to also be aware of what other people are dealing with, right? And so when I have listened to interviews with women who are talking about modesty, they, I feel like it's a healthy thing when they're doing it from a choice that they've made and values that they have versus somebody shaming them into conforming into a certain type of appearance that really has less to do with modesty and more to do with what that environment is wanting to use as a means of control. That's really important. Another thing that you want to pay attention to is the language that's being used and even who the target audiences are. I've heard of dress codes for modesty for very young children. And, even the way that it is communicated to those young children is done in a way that is harsh and is just not even age appropriate. So I want you to think about that. I'm looking at some notes here that I have regarding some examples of this. But when people go through this, spiritual abuse, and especially when modesty is thrown into it, it can make the person become very hyper aware of how they present, right? So if they wear something, it's, oh my gosh, well, what if someone interprets this as bad or causing lust? And so it becomes a situation where the person who is on the receiving end of it criticizes themselves and surveils them or surveys themselves too much, right? Self-surveillance. So surveillance. So, think about that. Think about how that has affected you if you've been through that. Many people will talk about how they are afraid to be seen. And, um, if someone comments about their appearance, say, oh, you look really pretty today, or something like that, instead of receiving it with joy, they receive it with shame and guilt because they're told you are being too flashy, you're drawing attention to yourself. So I want you to think about that. Again, it is based on choices. There are people that choose to dress a certain way because that's what they want to do. And they feel like, look, this is part of my spiritual practice. And that's great. Everyone has to make those decisions for themselves. It's just important that when you are in these environments that you pay attention to how that communication is communicated to you, and so the when you think about the issues related to what I talked about, right? The manipulation associated with dress codes and spiritual abuse, think about who benefits from that. I want you to anytime there is a situation where you are concerned about spiritual abuse, you're concerned about something, I want you to ask yourself who benefits from this. And in situations where this modesty message is um, delivered from a place of manipulation, the people in charge are the ones who benefit. Now you might think, well, why does that matter? Like, why does it matter? How do you someone in charge benefit from telling people how to dress? And it is all about control, right? It really doesn't matter what the control is related to. It is the fact that they are controlling what you can wear. And that is just another form of manipulation and intimidation, right? So that is where you need to focus your attention on. A lot of these environments, too, will place a disproportionate amount of blame on the way people dress for the way people react to that. So you've heard, the common thing that happens when somebody has been, I have to choose my words carefully because I don't want YouTube to censor this, but when a woman has been violated or assaulted, right, you'll often hear the question, well, what was she wearing? Meaning that she was responsible for being attacked. So I want you to think about that. And do you find that you hear those messages in spiritually abusive environments? Um, they often will put maybe like 95% of the responsibility on a woman and then 5% of the responsibility on the man in terms of controlling lust and things like that. And so people who have been through this feel very guilty, feel very horrible because they think they are supposed to be the ones that control how they are perceived. The message is imbalanced. There's little focus on the person who is looking and their issues regarding lust and their choice to gaze at this person and think these thoughts, right? So, again, this is a very nuanced discussion, and I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think about it? What have you been your experiences around modesty? And how do you feel that that affected you? For some people, it really has not had much of an impact, but I believe that for some other people, especially if they have come from other situations of abuse and control, that's just one more layer that they have to untangle in the recovery. So I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments about what you think. If you'd like a consultation, you can go to my website, skillsitecounseling.com, and click on the orange button. Hope you have a wonderful day that's filled with peace. Bye-bye.